For over 35 years, Todd Garner has overseen blockbuster films like Con Air, Anger Management, Triple X, 13 Going on 30, and the Mortal Kombat franchise.
Why are they letting you make these movies?
Join Todd as he shares tips and stories from the front lines of producing in Hollywood.
I'm Adam Sandler.
I'm Rebel Wilson.
This is Jeff Probst.
I'm Kaylee Cuoco.
I'm Eli Roth.
This is Marlon Wayans.
Hey, it's Ed Helms.
This is Shay Mitchell.
Hey everybody, this is Kevin James, and this is The Producer's Guide.
The Producer's Guide.
The Producer's Guide.
The Producer's Guide with Todd Garner.
Todd Garner.
Todd Garner.
Todd Garner.
What a combination.
Welcome to the Producer's Guide podcast. I'm Todd Garner. Today we're going to deep dive into a very special film, Lilo and Stitch. I wanted to try to do something a little bit different today, take one movie and really go through it from beginning to end. And the person I wanted to talk to about that today is co-CEO of Rideback, Jonathan Eirich, who has been at the forefront of creating captivating content that resonates with audiences around the globe. Since joining Rideback in 2015, after nearly a decade at DreamWorks and Amblin, Jonathan has produced some of the most successful films of our time, from Disney's billion-dollar blockbuster Aladdin, which redefined the musical genre, to the critically acclaimed The Two Popes, which earned 3 Oscar nominations. His portfolio is nothing short of impressive. And in 2023, he brought to life the highly anticipated Haunted Mansion and, most recently, produced a live-action adaptation of Lilo and Stitch, which not only shattered box office records, but also became the first Hollywood release of 2025 to surpass $1 billion worldwide. So enjoy today's deep dive into Lilo and Stitch, how the movie came about, how it was made, how it was marketed, and how it was ultimately received. Enjoy. All right, I'm here with Jonathan Eirich. Hello, Jonathan. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Todd.
I'm so grateful for you doing this because I find this movie really, really fascinating on a number of levels. One is I used to work at Disney, and one of the things that Michael Eisner was definitely against was ever taking any of the IP and remaking it live action. And you made $1 billion doing it. So clearly you did something right. It's the biggest live action remake to date as hybrid, right? Is that true?
Hybrid, maybe, yeah.
It's an incredible number. And I want to walk through it because the original Lilo and Stitch, which came out in 2002, was a hit. I mean, it made $273 million worldwide. Not a huge blockbuster, but then it had some real life after it. It had life on Disney Plus. They made some spin-off series. And also you started, if I'm not mistaken, you started this in 2018, correct?
That's right, yeah.
So this is kind of around the time that Sean was there and Sean Bailey was there, and they were having some success starting to look at their IP and redo it live action. And your partner on this was Dan Lin, who's now running features at Netflix.
Longtime partner, friend.
Started a company called Rideback with you. And famously, Dan was very well known for this, is really getting a lot of great IP. Lego Movie, this, other movies as well, and things. And so I'm just curious how the idea came to you, and what was the very first call that you guys made once you had the idea that, hey, Lilo and Stitch seems to be one that could be ripe for retelling?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of started for us, going back even further to when Aladdin started for us. So that was 2015. So I'd been a studio executive at DreamWorks Amblin for 9 years. I just left and partnered with Dan Lin sort of early 2015. And truly one of the first phone calls I made was to a friend of mine named Louis Provost, who was at the studio. And I said, is anyone doing a live action version of Aladdin? And this is the time where we just had heard that the Beauty and the Beast live action was going to go. It hadn't started yet, but it was sort of getting some momentum. And Aladdin was my favorite animated movie as a kid. I was like, if you're going to do it, I would love to be involved. And he had said, well, we don't really we have an action script. We're not really doing no one's doing the live action musical of Aladdin. I was like, can I bring in a take? And he said, sure. So I actually went to John August, who I'd worked with back at DreamWorks, and John just on spec came up with a pitch. And then we brought that into Louis and then eventually to Sean. And sort of end of 2015, they had bought that pitch and sort of put us on as producers. And then that was sort of the beginning of the Disney relationship for us. And then that one obviously led to, getting Guy Ritchie about a year later and then getting that into production in 2017. So by sort of late 2018, we'd gotten the movie into a really good place. It still wasn't going to come out till summer 2019. And we still white knuckled the release all the way through, and then ultimately made $1 billion on that one. So it was a very happy ending. But on that one, because the process had been going well, we'd sort of been talking to Disney of like, are you guys open to us, coming down on some of these other properties? And Lion King at that point was getting going, and so there was the signature ones, as they sort of called them, the Katzenberg, the golden ones, the Aladdin, the Beauty and the Beast, the Lion King, and Little Mermaid. And then, there was other ones that, were sort of being discussed. And this was not, Lilo and Stitch was not in that category. So it sort of came, though. We sold a spec with a writer named Mike Van Was to Warner Brothers. And in a meeting, sort of being like, what else can we do together? We started talking, and a colleague of mine, Ryan Halprin, had followed him on Instagram. And he's like, you dressed as Stitch for Halloween multiple years in a row. Do you love Lilo? He's like, I love it. And we're like, we've been talking about that as sort of an undervalued property out there, and maybe there's a way to sort of do that. Would you be interested? And he jumped at it, sort of came up with a live action take for it, and then we brought that in. And honestly, it was a little bit like, you guys want to do that one? No? Okay. Like it wasn't like this was competitive. There was 5 producers and there was a bake-off, and it just was, I think for all the reasons you said, it was sort of considered like it was a modest hit at best, and I think the real value was sort of the fan love that came out and sort of continued and just grew and grew for Stitch. But, again, to box office wise, it wasn't the biggest hit, even though it sort of was beloved. And honestly, I think an animated movie that was so far ahead of its time. If anything, I think it was dealing with a lot of dealing with like mental health. It was dealing with a lot of the sort of psychological issues with kids that we talk about now. It was a human family in Hawaii. It wasn't in a fantasy land, a fantasy kingdom. Like it was maybe too far ahead of its time in some ways as an animated film, but obviously really stuck with people, And so we brought that in, and similarly they said, okay, Mike wasn't a very expensive writer, so we went to script, and by 2019, then Aladdin had come out, and then it had a great year and sort of played. We got to $1 billion, and I think that gave us a little bit more credibility as producers at the studio, and certainly like with Sean and Louis and the whole team over there. And we got really excited about this one. We said, I think there's a movie here. Let us at least go explore directors.
Before you move on to the directors, let's back up for 1 second, because I want to talk a little bit about the darkness of it. Because yes, so the original writer, came up with this idea in 1981, and it was originally going to be a children's book. And Tom Schumacher, who was the head of Disney Animation at the time, when he went over and Chris Sanders went over and sold it to him, Tom saw it as like a really cool way to kind of look at what Dumbo did, which is very dark. I mean, that it's about a lot of things, Dumbo.
Yep.
And he kind of saw that he saw all of those things you said, the family drama and all of that. And Disney has had mostly success going from animation to live action, and some of their biggest successes, quite frankly, were pretty close to the animated movie, Beauty and the Beast being kind of the real most, and then other movies kind of trickling down from there to be less similar to the animated movie. Your movie, when you had your original pitch and you went in there, what was the pitch? Like, what is the difference? And how closely do you think Aladdin fell in that spectrum? And then did you kind of model that formula when you were coming up with the pitch for Lilo and Stitch? Walk me through sort of those discussions.
John August's initial pitch that we sold for Aladdin, I would say, is much more different than the animated movie than even what the final product ended up being. And I do think we learned some lessons along the way of just sort of what are the signposts in these movies that the audience loves. And you're like, okay, plant those in the ground. That we know that's a big movie moment we know works. And then you start changing a bunch of things around it, and suddenly those signposts get a little bit wobbly. And so you sort of come back to, okay, wait, why did that work? And then you sort of start putting some of those things back. And then, I think in the case of Aladdin, I think we really kind of modernized Jasmine. I think there was some big changes to the third act, and we're like, listen, Jafar is not going to turn into a giant snake in this movie. You know, there was a couple of those things where sort of like, I just don't think that's going to work in live action. But for the most part, every time we change certain things, then you're like, wait, but now the context of them getting on the carpet in the, that's a little bit different. Let's go back, And so we sort of did that. And I think you sort of found like if you're making changes for change's sake, just because you want to do something different, you have to be very careful, especially with these properties that are beloved. And, you tend to get in less trouble if you're delivering what the audience wants and expects. And you might get a little bit of like, that should have been more different. But I think for the ones that have gone and really changed things, I think that's when there's a sort of audience revolt. So I think some of that was in mind on this one. And again, I think the way the movie turned out actually is not totally dissimilar to the original pitch, which is if you see the 2025 movie, the first 30 or 40 minutes of it actually, I think, line up fairly closely to the animated movie. And then there start to be huge departures. We have a completely different villain and almost no scene is the same after about minute 40. And in a way, actually, when we did the test screenings, I think the audience had this thing where they sort of felt like they were in good hands. Like, okay, I recognize this. I know I like this. And they didn't mess it up. I think that's always what the audience thinks going into these things. Did they mess it up?
You're talking about Aladdin right now.
Well, I think both.
Just going back to Aladdin for 1 second. You also have to ask yourself as you're developing these movies, if there's a reason to change it.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that script went through development. It went through animation process, which is in and of itself is development because they put it on its feet so much and pour over it, much like theater. So a lot of those story beats had been pretty well pounded out and established. So you have to kind of ask yourself, are we changing it just to change it, or are we changing it because we're making it better or it works better in live action? And so you go through the whole process of screening and everything at Aladdin, and you can learn all those lessons. What was the North Star of the pitch of Lilo and Stitch?
I think the North Star was, this is one of the few that actually was set in modern day, a contemporary family, a family dealing with potentially being torn apart by social services. Like, it is a very grounded, it's like a Sundance drama at the center of then this insane Tasmanian devil blue alien comes into it. But I think there was something about it that almost felt live action in some ways, and there's such a grounded element to the animated movie that felt like, oh, you could really push this. You could really get a lot of emotion out of this family. And of all the things I'm sort of proudest of the movie, I think it is the amount of texts and emails and calls I got from people of like, I didn't expect to be in tears. Like, I was sobbing uncontrollably, and I think both kids and adults, I think it snuck up on you, the emotion, but I also think it's because it was in a sort of grounded human world. And like, we had that ability to sort of push that even further. And you just feel sometimes differently for a human actor going through that than you ever would for an animated human character. So I think that was a lot of it. Sort of how do we capture that? How do we capture and then still capture the sort of that sort of troublemaker playfulness that I think is the magic of the character. He's kind of the only real troublemaker in the Disney universe, and I think that's what people love about him. And part of, and I guess we'll get to this in a second, but part of why we ended up getting momentum on the movie, because we really had none as circa, 2020, even 2021. But I was noticing everywhere I went, and you always wonder as a producer, you're like, am I just seeing this because I'm working on the project? Is this just the weird way the universe works? Or is he just out in the zeitgeist all of a sudden, sort of for no reason? It wasn't like anything new had gotten made, but like I was seeing a Stitch stuffy in the back of a car in traffic. I was seeing a bumper sticker. I was seeing someone wear a t-shirt, a kid's backpack, and he was just around. And I think it's because people want to associate themselves. Like, no one wants to associate themselves with a perfect princess, but you want to associate yourself with like a fun troublemaker, and for whatever reason, this was coming back into the zeitgeist. And at one point, actually, as producers, we weren't really getting momentum. I'd asked our executive on the project, Louis, I was like, can you guys do some sort of brand study on, like, is it getting bigger? Is it just me? Like, I took my kids to the park the other week and like all I saw was Stitch, like Mickey's number one and Stitch was number two. He's like, yeah, we can do it. And they did a sort of internal report. And the first one sort of said like, it does well. Merchandising does well. It's sort of on par with these other things. It's not over-indexing. And it was like am I taking crazy pills moment, of like, just really? Okay. And then they literally did kind of the same study about 6 months later with a different team, and it was like, oh my God, this is the fastest growing character in the Disney universe in merchandise. It was like, this now makes sense. But honestly, that was one of those things that, like, when you talk about producing and like, why do you get momentum at certain times? Like, you could do everything you can with the right script and the right director, but sometimes you do need those things that are just something's happening in the zeitgeist that makes this feel like there's an audience demand, and then suddenly a studio sees that, and then all of a sudden it was, okay, go get a director and make this. But at that time, we were still making it for Disney Plus at that moment.
Well, let's talk about that. So first of all, let's talk about the producing all up till this point. The producing is pretty incredible. You having the foresight to call your executive at Disney and say, hey, what about Aladdin? And then them saying, oh, look, if you have a great take, and then calling John August, the perfect person to do it, and then coming in with a pitch, all producing, amazing. And then getting that team to $1 billion is also an incredible feat. Also, given the fact that Robin Williams wasn't around any longer to play the genie, which everybody kind of always thought was the secret sauce of that franchise. So kudos to you guys for getting it there without him and replacing him with Will, which was genius. And then also just then the whole Lilo and Stitch of it too, just the being aware and then being able to do things like see somebody on Instagram and see that he likes Stitch. Like, all those things are what producers do. And also it bears repeating that it wasn't a competitive thing. Most people think when you see a movie that makes $1 billion and it's guys like you, oh, you've got a silver spoon, you've got all this power, they must have come to you. But no, you went in, you produced it, you did it. Nobody else was thinking of it, and you got it done. And that's the key to producing at any level. And quite frankly, anybody who knew Louis' number could have done the same. So that's another thing about just sort of dispelling the myth of how of what producing is. Yes, it's hard, but it also just takes initiative and imagination. And so once you go and you at one point you had John Chu attached to direct, is that correct?
We did, yeah.
This is a famous part of this franchise, is that it was a Disney Plus movie until it wasn't, and then it makes $1 billion, which is also the interesting thing, which also I just want to briefly mention. That movie was supposed to be streaming on Disney Plus, would have been great, because, by the way, that's where Lilo was living, Lilo and Stitch was living, which is generating all that excitement and generating all that demand for merch. It was on Disney Plus. And so it's going to be on Disney Plus because the original movie made about $270 million, and that's probably around what they were feeling this movie probably could have done, and probably that therefore would be better on Disney Plus. Also, your budget was constrained, I'm assuming. But then the movie grosses $1 billion. Had it gone to Disney Plus, you never would have known that. And that's what's so interesting about streaming, is that you just never know what your movie would do. And it's an interesting conversation, because a lot of times I hear when people pass, it goes, well, it just feels like streaming. I'm like, well, does it?
Yeah.
Because that movie could have easily, for every reason, these people aren't wrong. For every reason, it made sense to go to Disney Plus. Had they done that, they'd have lost $1 billion. And that's always in the back of my mind when I hear executives saying, oh, it feels like streaming. That, there's a lot of movies that feel like streaming that massively successful in the box office, and I always am curious how many of those opportunities are missed because we just assume, like, oh well, eat low hanging fruit. Let's just put it there. So you're on Disney Plus. You have John Chu for a second, then you lose John Chu. Start there. Start there. You're still making it for Disney Plus, so it's got to be tougher to find a director at that point, because there's not a huge amount of upside at that point.
Yeah, no, it was. And John actually was before, and again, this other study I sort of referenced, it was sort of the second study.
That's also a genius move as a producer, to tell them to do that research, that you're noticing. It's like when you buy a blue car and you can only notice blue cars, and to just dissuade yourself of that notion that was it real or was it imaginary? And that's also a great piece of producing. I just wanted to bring that up. Sorry to interrupt you.
Thanks. But yeah, so it was sort of before this second study came out that was like, oh wait, it's massive, and you guys have to go. We were just trying to, as you do, as we all do, you try to sort of just will these things into existence of, like, there's a script people like, no one's saying we need to make this movie. What's that thing you can do to give it some momentum? And so, Dan and I went to John Chu, and he was like, I love the original. I spend tons of time in Hawaii. I've got family there. I'd love to do this. And, we did say it would be Disney Plus, and John was great and sort of was okay with that. It ended up being a little bit of a deal-making issue. And, there's just caps on some of the Disney Plus deals. And, I think John was willing to do it for less than, he could have gotten elsewhere. But it was, some of the caps and no back end and certain things just didn't work. And as he was going through this, he was, and he told us, he was like, I'm just so you know, I'm meeting on Wicked. I'm meeting on Wicked again. I'm having I'm like, by the end of it, as like the deal wasn't working out, I think you should probably go take Wicked. I think that's probably a good choice. So movie worked out for both of us. We both, we're happy. But yeah, so we lost John then. And then fortunately, this sort of other study came out internally. Suddenly we had this momentum. I was down on set actually in Atlanta on a different Disney movie. We were doing Haunted Mansion for Disney at the time and got a call from our executive who said, hey, there's some real momentum. Everyone's sort of suddenly talking about this title internally, still talking about it for Disney Plus. But if you can get a director quickly, we could get some momentum on this. And it's the call you always want to hear as a producer, because you're just, you bang the drum so long. And at that point, that was 2022. So, at this point, you're heading into 4+ years of something that just feels like a little bit of a boulder up the hill. Then suddenly you get this call that says, hey, there might be a window if you get a director quickly. Having gone through the process with John, and we actually even had like a sort of flirtation with Destin Cretton too at some point, who was also Hawaiian, who was interested, but then sort of got sucked into the Marvel universe. And so we sort of knew, like, because of the deal making, like there's don't shoot for some of these people that it's going to be hard to make a deal with, or might not want to do it for Disney Plus. So we just went out quickly to sort of, okay, who are some realistic targets, and, started taking some meetings. And then fortunately somebody sent us a link before it came out of Marcel the Chef. And we saw the movie and literally were in tears watching it on a laptop one night on this link. And it's like, this is exactly what we want. This is sort of the heart and humor, the sort of cleverness, sort of adult sense of humor that we wanted to bring to it, so it doesn't feel like a quote unquote kids movie, and real emotion. If you can get that much emotion out of a shell, like surely you can get it out of Stitch. So it was kind of this crazy thing, because we went to Dean, but also that it was sort of an incoming link because he was such a fan of Lilo and Stitch. It was sort of that perfect thing of like the sample you suddenly had watched, the director you suddenly thought maybe is perfect for it, also is this massive diehard fan. And again, was a little bit of like, I was sort of the age of like the Katzenberg era was like my childhood, that sort of 2002, like he was closer to sort of that age of like when you saw it and the impact it had on you. And he was just a super fan and really sort of understood the character. So, we got him hired pretty quickly, and then hired a Hawaiian writer who was amazing, this writer named Chris Bright, to sort of bring some authenticity. I think that was one of the other things we really looked at as a North Star of like, how do you really shoot on the island, embrace the culture of the island, embrace all Hawaiian crews and Hawaiian cast, and sort of bring out some of those elements of the island you might not see. And, Dean's pitch actually originally was a great one. He was like, I think we shoot the front of the postcard a lot. I want to see the back of the postcard in Hawaii. I want to see where people really live, like what it's really like for locals. And again, the sort of the setup of, social services and this family sort of struggling, economically, everything else. And, but again, just had like a lot of heart in his take, and it felt like this was the right way to do it. So I hired a writer, and suddenly we were, in a rewrite, and now you're sort of starting to head towards soft prep at that point.
When you guys are making the movie, since it's Disney Plus, I'm assuming you had a lot of budget constraints, which isn't fun when you have a hybrid movie with a character that's all CG. What were those conversations? And by the way, I'm sure you're grateful for them now when you get your profit participation. But at that time, it must have been really hard to figure out how to get this thing across the finish line. Shooting in Hawaii with a CG character, musical, walk me through kind of the pre-production conversations that were had, and the challenges and problems that were overcome during that process.
At the time they were saying they weren't making any Disney Plus movies for more than 75, maybe 80. That was sort of like a tent pole on Disney Plus at the time. And they just made Rescue Rangers. That was actually even a little bit less than that, but that was considered like a big Disney Plus movie. So that was initially the box we were supposed to fit in. But again, a lot of CG characters, a huge one in Stitch, and, what ended up being, close to 2,000 VFX shots in the movie, along with shooting in Hawaii, which is, as you know, not the most cost-efficient place to shoot, but we really did like the idea of shooting the entire movie there, and really embracing sort of that spirit and these Hawaiian crews. And Disney was really on board with that, and sort of all the cultural advisors at Disney really wanted to do that as well. But again, it's more expensive. It's the reason a lot of movies go there for 2 weeks and then they shoot in Atlanta, or they go there for 2 weeks and they shoot in New Zealand. So it was all sort of contributing to a budget that was, there was no way this was going to be under 95 at best, and even then they'd said it's got to be 80, it's got to be 90. And then fortunately we started, creating some materials, and you get a little bit more pregnant with it, and then all of a sudden it starts kind of creeping up towards 100. And then it was sort of like, okay, that's the line now, but if you guys can bring it in there, we'll make it, which I think also sort of coincided. They weren't telling us at the time, but I think this was the moment where they were starting to look at, what's really working best in terms of movies on Disney Plus. It's big theatrical events, then go to Disney Plus and are doing better than Disney Plus only movies, as many other studios were figuring out at the same time. So I think the beginnings of the conversation of like, maybe this should go theatrical. Also at that point, we were a couple years away from COVID too. And I think just I think a lot of the, like, it's Disney Plus was contributed not just to how big or not they thought the movie was, but also just where we were in COVID and how people were valuing streaming and subscriber numbers on Wall Street and all those other things that I think were pushing a sort of event movie like this towards Disney Plus. Suddenly those were starting to get unpeeled kind of like late 2022. And, again, they didn't say that to us at the time, but I think everyone was thinking, maybe this is theatrical, and maybe you give the budget, extra, 5 or 10 million and let them go make a movie that, if it's good, if it feels like it plays, could be theatrical. So
Those were conversations you were having before you started shooting? You actually had a kind of maybe a chance at theatrical before you started shooting?
nothing that was over, but I think it was sort of like, I think if this was definitely only Disney Plus, I think they would have held the line at 90 and said, absolutely not, But again, you're sort of pointing to all these things like, listen, we're going to have to cut this sequence, or we're going to have to cut this or that if we're really going to get to that number, and as you know, you can make a movie for any price, like we can make it for 20, we can animate the last 70 minutes of it, hand draw, like, you can do, what do you want? What's the appetite? I think they didn't want to cut some of the things that I think they realized, were important and, were going to be big sequences, and ultimately okayed it, I think, believing that, this movie would have a shot at theatrical. But yeah, again, it was never presented overtly to that. But I think sort of, myself, the director, we sort of went to Hawaii thinking, let's go make a movie that's actually worthy of the big screen too. So,
and you also are working with a minor. So I'm assuming you had a lot of days you had to shoot, because you can't shoot
huge
her very long. And so do you remember how many days that your shoot was?
Well, so the shoot was interesting. So when you talk about all the ups and downs, so we initially had sort of targeted a start date that we thought could wrap us if a so-called potential strike happened, but it's probably not.
Which was never going to happen.
Not going to happen. They're going to figure it out, but it won't happen. But it was such an aggressive start date that it was a little bit of like, do we do this on the assumption that the strike is going to happen and maybe sacrifice stuff up front that we're not prepared for? Or do we sort of push back to a more reasonable start date and hope the strike doesn't happen? So we took the latter. And again, I think it was time that we needed to really get the movie right and sort of, previs things. And again, with a character that wasn't there on set, that's sort of the star of the movie, the approach to that and how we were going to film that, I think it was really valuable time. It also pushed the start date well past this supposed strike date. So, we went into production, probably shot about 60% of the movie, 60 to 65% of the movie when the strike hit in July 2023. So yeah, that was definitely a hit financially, but also weirdly creatively, I actually think it benefited the movie quite a bit, because give all the credit in the world to Disney for this, because they did okay a little bit of an extra spend, and it wasn't huge, but we did open up editorial, and initially they said, shut everything down. It's a strike. And that was sort of the thing that most studios are doing across the board. And we sort of begged, like, just do a small editorial, literally just an editor, an assistant editor, the director, a PA, myself will be there. And we cut the sort of 65% of the movie we had. And then we sort of plopped in storyboards or cards for the rest of it. And I think we had a really good sense of what was playing and what wasn't. And so when we went back to finish principal photography, it sort of ended up almost being a principal photography / reshoots. And there was stuff that was scheduled that we ended up scrapping, and we were sort of swapping out for new scenes that we realized we needed. And, so we never actually did any reshoots on this movie because this sort of second stage, the sort of post-strike photography, ended up being a version of that. So I don't think we would have ever known those things had we not open up editorial and cut what we had, but it ended up being like a really efficient second part of the shoot. But that didn't end until we went back into prep in January 2024, and sort of mounted production February, March 24, and sort of wrapped at the end of March 24. So it was a bifurcated shoot, which wasn't easy. And then, you had to switch out a ton of crew by the time you came back the second time. And although, again, the other thing that benefited us, our star, Maya, was 5 when she sent in her casting tape, 6 when we cast her. She was a year older by the time we went back for that. And there are performances, there's moments in the movie that, I think she gets to she's only 7, but she gets to it in an amazing way. But I think there was a level of experience and polish coming back that, I'm not sure we would have been able to get had it just been sort of one continuous shoot and, wrapped on time, wrapped on schedule. So it did end up being a very hard thing to deal with and navigate, and what we were going to do with, sets and shutting down and, all the shipping containers that have to go from Hawaii back to, all that stuff was sort of a nightmare. But I think creatively it actually ended up really benefiting the movie.
So I'm assuming your original shoot days were like 80 to 90 probably budgeted?
Yeah, and I think we came in around there, give or take. We probably added a couple days in that second part of photography to, again, sort of reshoot additional photography days, but it ended up being pretty close to the original schedule, just sort of broken up over these two.
Sure. It's pretty amazing considering you have a 5-6-year-old and a CG character. That's even in 90 days is pretty impressive. And then walk me through the casting of Maya. How did that come about? What was the process there? Disney's really good at it. So what was the process there?
Yeah, we had committed pretty early on, like, this is going to be like, a Hawaiian actress born in Hawaii. Like, we're not going to look at anyone else. And, that limits the pool, and you're looking at it. And actually, we started looking at probably actors even like 9 and 10 years old, some of which were quite good. And I think our director quickly pointed out, he's like, there's just something you lose with this character at that age. And there's a thing where she's such a troublemaker, but there's this innocence that you have at 5, at 6 that, like, you don't know any better. You can sort of get away with it. And you watch a kid do the same thing at 9 or 10, and you're a little bit like, probably just a jerk, So
that kid's a juvenile delinquent.
Yeah. And so that made it even harder because, again, to Dean's credit, he was like, I think we need to cast like a 6-year-old. And everyone's like, oh God, it's like the hours are even worse for a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
And like, there's so many other things that, they're going to have no acting experience. And so we saw sort of every kid you could imagine, which wasn't the biggest pool to begin with. And we did a callback of about 5 actors. And Maya's tape came in then. We'd already called back 5 actors, and then they were coming to our production office in Oahu, and we saw this tape of Maya, and we're like, oh my God, get her in too. And so we sort of added her last minute. I think she was even like a day late to this sort of like casting session. We're sort of putting them through the paces, and she was just like magical. She was Lilo, but she was and she wasn't. You could tell she could act. She could take on a character. She had no acting experience. She's never done like a play at school. She had never done anything. She just had this personality. And as the director and I would joke about a lot, we would always say, she's the only girl here who dragged her parents to the audition.
Right.
She was pulling them along. Her mom is so nice, so like not a stage mom at all. Like, it was sort of just, I don't even know what we're doing here. There was definitely other parents that were pushing their kids towards this part and saw the opportunity. It was all Maya, and you just realize she had this spunk, this personality. And then the one thing we did, which I think was really helpful, we did this day of like just stacking a few scenes in a row. And in a way, it was like almost an endurance test, because that's the other hard thing with a kid. You can see them, they're great for 20 minutes and then they're distracted. And, like you've got to keep that focus over the course of a day. And just the energy was nonstop, she's more energetic than I am by a mile. She's more polished on a red carpet than I am by a mile. She's just that person, and it's just,
Wow.
Some people are born that way. And but honestly, that was getting pretty close to our start date. So like you always had this thing where, again, as you know, like you start getting momentum on these movies, you start building, there's construction, it's all feeling good. We're working on the script, the draft's getting better. And then you're like, it's called Lilo and Stitch and we don't have a Lilo, and it's not one of those like, well, if you don't find so-and-so, you'll just cast so-and-so. Like there's no one else. Like we have to find a 6-year-old in Hawaii who can do this and carry a feature film. And you get scared at a certain point. Like, I don't know if this person's going to come up. And I don't know, even the like loveliest, most adorable, young girls we had trying out, like, I don't know if you can back that and even say to the studio, yes, we should make $100 million movie with this person as the lead. So when she came out, it certainly was like this is fallen from heaven. And like, we have our Lilo, we can make this movie now. And, that was kind of the critical moment. But that was like January, February 23, and we were starting April. So, we were probably 2 months out. And then it's, of course, you want to get her trained and you have to do water training and you've got to do all these other things with a 6-year-old. Even the training hours are so limited with them. So it was a rush for sure, but we got the right person.
So walk me through the days, because you can only work a 6-year-old 4 hours. She can only be on set. She pumpkins at 8. She can't be on set past 8 p.m. She has to go to school. So how, walk me through a day on Lilo and Stitch.
Yeah, it's just, it's that scheduling nightmare, of like you're putting scenes that don't always make sense to shoot on the same day, or you're changing locations of other scenes because it needs to be closer, because you just have to have something to fill the day. So every day is always sort of built in a way of like, okay, we've got this critical thing. We would always do her scenes in the morning. Usually sort of like 2 hours, then a break, and she would see the set teacher, and then, maybe 2 hours after that. And then she was done. And then you had to figure out, okay, what do we have that, what good chunk do we have that we can shoot in the afternoon? And there's certainly days where you're like, we're shooting plates for the last 2 hours, like just shoot the living room plates that we're going to need when Stitch trashes this place later, because like there was nothing else you could put in that chunk of the schedule, but yeah, it really was driven by her scenes and getting her scenes in the morning, like when you're fresh, when you're focused, and like knowing you sort of knocked out the most important things. But yeah, it's hard, and like when things are coming natural to a kid and the scene's going great, like it's easy. Like everyone's having a great time. Like when a kid is struggling, it's just, you're just checking the hours, you're checking the minutes, and you're like, and then you get to that very uncomfortable, like, should we move on? Should we move on? And like the director says he doesn't have it. I sort of agree with him, but I also like, if we don't move on, we're not going to get to any of the, like we can't cut this scene and we're not coming back to this location. So I find that to be one of the hardest things as a producer, where you're sort of like creatively, I agree. Like I don't want to move on either, but we're at take 10 and we've got this to get through. And as you said, there's no like, oh, we'll go to 1 hour overtime. We'll figure.
Oh, no. It is the most intense. That last 5 minutes is the most intense thing, because they're like, she pumpkins in 5 minutes. Okay. Yep. You have 1 minute. It's not like you can keep it's not like at the end of this take, it is bye. Here she goes and she's off. Would you shoot her whole side first and then come back and turn around on Stitch or turn around on the other actors?
And sometimes, yeah. Then you give her the break and you could actually do the other side. And, depending on, which actor was in the scene, if they could do it without her, you could do those as well. But there was also plenty of time where just, you're looking at the shot list and you're like, this is a great job. We're not doing this, like scrap that. Like, what do you actually need to cut the scene? And that was hard, and this was Dean's first like full live action feature, and I think there was a lot of things he wanted to sort of do artistically. And then there's certain times where you're like, you're just going to have to abandon that plan. And like, what's the absolute minimum we can get that still is going to make this scene work? So, but yeah, I mean, again, the same thing. It's like, you're telling somebody to move on and you're like, deep in your heart, you're like, I agree with you. I don't want to either, but like,
Yeah.
we are, and
And there's no joke. It's not, yeah. And then you have all the people staring at you going, don't go 1 second over. It
Yeah.
will not be good for this production. So you have a 6-year-old, and let's make it a little harder. You have a character that's not there. How did you accommodate Stitch on set with a 6-year-old? Because you see, like Project Hail Mary, they've been showing the puppet, and the puppeteer acted with Ryan. And so Ryan always had somebody that he could act with. So how did it work with Stitch?
Yeah, a lot of different ways. So we had a full puppeteer with a puppeted Stitch, which was really helpful. But a lot of times, you get into sort of more intimate moments, or she's hugging him, or certain elements like it just doesn't fit or doesn't work. There was times there was just a stuffy, and we had the stuffy that she would take around. She would like give it a kiss and say goodnight to Stitch every night on set, and like put the stuff. And that actually sometimes she got her best performances truly with just a stuffy there.
Did you have an actor acting with her?
We had our acting coach named Sarah Arrington, who's amazing. And so she would do a lot of the rehearsals with Maya, and then she would be there. Sometimes she would puppet sometimes this like hand puppet one that wasn't the sort of professional puppet one. She would sit like under the bed sometimes and do the voice with her. So she was incredible. She would wedge herself into corners and rooms to, whatever had to be done to sort of give her something to go back and forth from. But then the other funny thing we had, whenever there was sort of like scenes of chaos, we had a bulldog, and there's one time you can see him in the movie. There's a scene where Stitch looks at the ocean and there's a bulldog surfing. It sort of gives him the idea that he can surf on a board as well. That bulldog was also the stunt dog that,
oh, wow.
Like when she's trying to put Stitch in the bathtub, she's literally holding a squirmy bulldog and trying to just
that's fun.
in the water. And it was really that thing of like, it's just so hard. I mean, it's hard for adult actors to sometimes physically feel and engage in that way. I mean, especially for a kid to be like, pretend this alien is squirming around. Like, it just the physicality of like how you're doing it. So we had that, which at times didn't work so well, but at times like you would get scenes like the bathtub scene that actually worked quite well and like felt very real with her. And then at other times, honestly, VFX was like, we really need the ugly gray VFX Stitch in for this scene. And honestly, she could act with it. That was incredible. Like the times that like they wanted the sort of the VFX version because they didn't want to do the paint outs, and like it's like this dead-eyed, disgusting looking gray Stitch. And she would give incredible performances with that too.
Wow.
A combination of all four of those that were sort of being rotated at any one time.
The bulldog is such a great idea. Whose idea was that?
That was Dean's idea.
It's a great idea.
Not a line producer's favorite idea. The bulldog was more expensive than you thought. And like,
I was going to say, creatively, it's a good idea. I was like, did you shave the bulldog and put dots all over it?
A line producer sometimes would be like, okay, the dog is making the 7th most money today of everyone.
Yeah.
Point this out a few times.
So tell me, you besides the strike, and I'm sure also in terms of the methodology of shooting her and how to shoot her and coverage and the dog and the dead-eyed gray, it probably helped that break too, to evaluate all those ways you did that and figure out the most effective ones and scrap the ones that weren't as effective, and probably made you more effective coming back. Besides that obvious hiccup, I had it too, by the way. I was right with you. We shut down Mortal Kombat 2 for 8 months.
Yeah.
That was fun. Besides that hiccup, what was the biggest challenge? And did you have any like real, every set movie does, did you have any real problems you guys had to overcome? Like I don't want to say scary moments, but like moments?
We had a couple. Our costume truck was burned down the first day of shooting. This was a arson that never went much further than that, and we won't go into the details of why and how it happened.
No, look, it's not a secret that Hawaii locals don't love movie shoots and TV shoots there, and if you're in their way and they don't, you're infringing on something that they consider theirs or sacred to them in any way, whether it's real or not, in terms of actual sacred, it's sacred to them. It's hard. I've shot a couple movies in Hawaii. You have to be really mindful of that.
You do, and it was clearly somebody understood how movies work, because if you had burned down the costume or the makeup truck, we were doing fine. We just shot the next day. Burning down the costume truck, which had the first 2 weeks of costumes on it, like that was tough. So that was like how we started out of the gate long before we even got to the strike. And then the funny thing, and again, you've shot in Hawaii too, and you know this, but like you look at these weather reports, and you and I might as well just make them up of the morning of, because like there's so many microclimates. So where we built the Pelikai house, which was like the hero house for Lilo and her sister Nani, it's got this beautiful mountain behind it. It's like this amazing location. It was just raining there. And you're like, it says sunny everywhere else. And by the way, you could drive down to the water less than a mile, take a left, and it was sunny. It was gorgeous. And it was raining there. And then you'd be like, well, it won't rain for more than, 30 minutes. Let's wait it out. Then it's an hour and a half. Then it's 2. And then throw that onto kid hours that you haven't factored, where she's on the clock for the rain. And like, we hadn't broken her because we kept being like, oh, it's got to stop. And then we'll get this shot in. That was a bit of a nightmare too. So, and it's just so unpredictable that, it's hard to like actually be efficient and schedule your days in the right way. Then you end up compromising other creative things because you just have to rush through. And like, we're here today, we've got to get these things, and we lost 3 hours, of just total dead time. So, I think those were probably the biggest ones, but there was many other small ones along the way. But yeah, it was not an easy shoot by any means. And
the other thing about shooting in Hawaii that's interesting is everything's an hour away, and everything's an hour away. Even though the island is not huge, everything's an hour away, and you always end up shooting an hour away. No matter where you are, it always feels like it takes an hour to get there.
Not only that, again, trying to keep a budget down. Like we didn't have any of the stages together. We didn't have construction with our stages. Everything was scattered. So the amount of money you're paying for like union drivers and moving the trucks around and all that stuff, I mean, it adds up so fast, but there's no other way to do it. That was definitely a budget hit and a time hit. And then, it would always be those things too, where you're talking to someone like, oh, we have to wrap now because turnaround, and you're like doing the turnaround math and you're like, what? Why do we have to, we should have another hour, Nope, because they've got to go there, and then they got to implement the country, and then they got to go.
So funny.
Like, oh God, we really do have to wrap right.
And you go, if I'm on this highway one more time driving around this island. So you wrap and you begin editing. What was your biggest surprise?
Well, I mean, the edit was a challenge. I think the biggest surprise is like actually a lot of what we learned from that first cut during the strike was really informative to go back to get the right pieces. And I think we did get the right pieces. Weirdly, it didn't speed up getting to like a faster, better director's cut somehow. Like it still felt like you were starting over on the edit when we wrapped in March 24. And I think the studio had sort of assumed like, hey, we'd opened the edit before to figure a lot of these things out. Like this will be 8 weeks and we'll be like in a great place. And so when we did our studio screening just of the director's cut, needless to say, it didn't go great. And it was hard. And I think for a couple of reasons. One, I think the cut was probably in a rough place at the time, and certain choices that ended up, being easy lifts came out of it. And 2, it's just hard to watch him. I mean, it's hard. I had seen every single previs possible, and it's still hard to watch a movie when your main character at that point like isn't in it at all, And so when you go and then sometimes you are bouncing in a cut from a dead-eyed previs Stitch to a stuffy Stitch to nothing there to gray Stitch in one scene, like
to a bulldog.
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard for anyone to react to this and feel good about it, when they're saying, what did we get for our $100 million? It's like, yeah, I know. You're nervous. It's going to be okay.
Yeah. At that point, you're like, your $100 million hasn't even started to be spent. We have 2,000 visual effect shots. Trust me. The money's going to go. You'll see the money in a minute.
But I would say I did reassure everyone. So at that point, there had been a change in the studio. David Greenbaum had come in sort of around the time we were wrapping the movie. So we were still in production. We sort of wrapped March 24. He was now running it, but hadn't been there for that. So he sees this cut, and David's a friend. And I sort of said, I'm like, we're going to be okay. Like, I know how everyone feels about this, and for good reason, but I promise you we're going to be okay, because the things to me that really mattered at that point, like there was about 4 or 5 moments, like I was generally getting goosebumps. I was tearing up. And at that point I'd seen a lot of these scenes a bunch of times, and I'm like, I'm still tearing up near the end. Like this is the 5th time, 7th time I've seen this. I'm like, that tells you something, we know we have a few of these things that are working. We know you have 2 amazing performances from two relative unknowns, and Sydney Agadonga plays Nani, and Maya, of course, who plays Lilo. And, they were both incredible in the movie. Like, that sister relationship, like, that stuff was really working already in the director's cut. And a lot of it was just, again, either Stitch wasn't there or we hadn't fully mapped out, like, what is the funniest, best chaotic sequence. And so, this was definitely the case of when people say the movie's made in post, this movie was definitely made in post.
And by that point, had you put Chris's voice in, the original writer-director who had voiced the
only
character?
voice we put in was stuff that it was actually the same from the animated movie. We hadn't recorded with Chris at that point, but we took a lot of Stitchisms from the animated movie, just the audio tracks, and we would drop them in certain places. But we didn't have a Stitch record at that point.
Oof. And David doesn't come from like a studio that was used to screening movies with 2000 visual effects missing, right? He was not his background. So I'm sure he was like, what the actual hell? But then I'm more curious about your first preview, because we all do it. You have to preview without your visual effects in. So the methodology generally is, and I'm sure it was some version of this, is finish one sequence pretty good, show the audience that sequence and say, this is what it's going to look like. So for the rest of the movie, use your imagination. And usually Kevin Getz stands in front of the thing and says, listen, what New Line does is they actually have one of our actors say, it's all going to be good, don't worry, before the movie starts. But at least somebody will say, hey, this is going to be weird. The visual effects are going to be perfect. Here's the example of what Stitch looks like in your movie. Use your imagination. How did that go?
Yeah, it's, you've done those zero reels before. I think those zero reels, I think it's worth doing them. I think they're helpful. I think the audience forgets 2 minutes after they saw that and they're like, why is it like this? And also when you're testing Lilo and Stitch, like, you want 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds in the audience, so now you're like, again, it's one thing for an adult to try to make the leap of like, oh, this doesn't look like it. This doesn't look very good. It doesn't look like it's done. To tell a 6-year-old, like, by the way, in my barometer, I've got a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old at home, and I would be showing them scenes all the time. And so I showed them this one scene that was like heavily prevised, and you could just tell they both got really uncomfortable, and they were like, Dad, are you going to finish this, or is this no, it's okay. It's just
what do you do all day, Dad? You went away to do this?
This doesn't look like a movie. Is my one note.
So how did those previews go? And what did you learn?
So we did get to push back our first preview, and we did say, listen, give us time in post. The notes are right, which is the cut's not there. Also, we'll just keep layering in more and more VFX shots. We also then hired a bunch of like 2D animators, which ended up being really key too, because you realize, like, as these VFX shots come in, like, unless they're really being done by like animators with comedy chops, like, you're getting shots back where you're like, great, we can sort of drop some of these in. They're 75% there, but they're sort of lifeless, And in fact, actually, some of the scenes that had more shots in it were playing worse, because you're saying, oh, this is pretty close to what it's going to be. And it's not good. It's not funny. As opposed to, at least sometimes when you're seeing like bad hand-drawn, you kind of just go with this gag, like, it literally looks like I drew it with a crayon, but like, I get what it is and I can sort of laugh at it. So sort of dangerous sometimes when you're putting the 75, 80% shots done, because it's not funny. It's sort of dead-eyed, the timing's off. And so we actually hired a bunch of 2D animators and sort of said, can you take a look at these sequences and like, we have a lot of plates. Throw out gags. Like, we can do singles on him. Like, what else can we be doing here? How do we up some of these jokes? So we were sort of doing that as we're recutting, as we're sort of trimming, from a 2-hour, 5-minute cut, and you're getting it down to 152 and 145, and you're sort of trimming away as you're trying to like add all these gags in. So we did get to push back the first preview, and the first preview, again, the cut was still a little rough. VFX certainly very rough. But we tested much higher than anybody thought we were going to, and I think this was like a shift internally of like, I think it went from like, oh dear, what is this, to like, okay, maybe this can get there, So it was a pretty critical stage for us of just like, we're going to continue. Like, I had moved into the Frank G. Wells building at that point on the Disney lot, because we had editorial and VFX both there. So I'm there, 6 to 8 hours a day, every single day, just bouncing from either editorial to VFX reviews. And it just was one of those situations where like it was just a grind. And like, you have those days where you're like, is this movie getting any better? Like, I think it is. We're giving the right notes, I think, but like you're just chipping away every single day. And then suddenly you have a screening a couple months later where you're like, oh, this is now starting to play. Like you can really feel it. So, that was definitely the like dark night of the soul moment, I would say, is like living in Frank G. Wells and just being like, I think we're going to get this there. And again, I kept coming back to like, but I still get goosebumps. I'm still crying at this. I kept coming back to like, I know we've got things, and I know we've got a character that audiences love. Like we just have to get him there. We have to make him as much of a troublemaker as we can, as funny as we can, and like throw as many gags as we can in there. And we just kind of kept doing it, but it was nonstop. And the VFX reviews were 4 to 5 hours a day, every single day, and we were really meticulously going through.
Yeah. And the scary part for the studio is every shot you cut is just money thrown out the window because you're not getting it back.
Yep.
So to animate Stitch costs money. The further down the line you go costs money. And then if that scene's not working, you throw that scene out. That's just gone. That money's gone. So the fact that they gave you more time is really commendable to them and brave, because that's the worst, is when you're cutting 5 minutes of 60% or 70% shots that are rendered. So you lock the picture. When did the idea to go theatrical finally cement?
That was July 24. So this is around the time of that first preview. That was when we were officially told. Again, my guess is obviously it sort of happened sooner. They sort of planned it. But that was it. There was no sort of official declaration that this was going theatrical until then. And that was sort of because of the D23 conference that that was coming up in August 24. So they wanted to announce Stitch. We wanted to do a little piece of Stitch. That was going to be the first reveal of like the sort of live action Stitch, and then announce that it had a theatrical release date.
And did that come from the preview scores, do you think?
I think it probably came before then. I think there was enough belief in the character, and, as much I think worry as there was internally about the cut, I do think there was like a lot of excitement, and Asad Ayaz and Martha Morrison there in marketing, they were like, we love this. We know how to sell it, and they had seen a lot of different pieces, and they were like, we have the stuff, we can sell this. We can make this big, then it was like, but go back to work and get the cut. But there was a lot of support there. So,
and I'm assuming the merch kept selling and it kept growing and growing. And so what was that D23 conference like?
It was crazy because, obviously they're putting out, huge celebrity after huge celebrity, and there's more finished movies. But we had, to Disney marketing's credit, they like had this really fun idea where it was just going to sort of interrupt one of the trailers, like, as they were sort of going movie to movie in like this sort of scratchy interruption. And then Stitch, it was like this camera of Stitch's ship crash landing outside of the Honda Center in Anaheim, and then him coming in, the power went out. And then the power comes back on, and he sort of like rips through the screen and sort of reveals himself. And the squeals and screams when he ripped through, like that was definitely one of those moments of like, oh, we have something, like as long as this is, and the movie can even half deliver what the enthusiasm, excitement of this moment is, like, this is a thing. That was, I think, the first time I was like, because at that point, like, again, you're never thinking about $1 billion for these movies. You're just like, I just want it to be good. I just want it to work. But that was the first time you're like, oh, this could be really big, just based on this sort of like visceral reaction. And at that point, I mean, there's 16,000 people in that theater. And again, they're diehard Disney fans, so, you're playing to the home crowd, but there was a reaction that just like people were starving for this, craving it. And I think once the first teaser came out too, it was like, I even just the sort of litmus test you do with your kids of like, is anyone talking at school about this? Oh my God, everyone, like this girl in my class said this and this girl, like, okay, all right, just keep that going. But, you could sort of start feeling it after that it felt like, okay, we still didn't really lock until December. So it was like from that point on, it was like it still was, some hard days to get it all the way there. But at least at that point, it felt like, okay, we're chasing something now that feels like it can be really big if we get this right.
Did it come on tracking like a monster, or did it come on tracking big and then kept growing? How did that
It
play
was
out?
sort of the latter, but honestly, the other really critical piece was, we talked about a couple times. We're like, are we going to do a Super Bowl spot? Are we going to do a Super Bowl spot? And sort of knew the other movies that were out there doing it. And, the campaign, and they've just been so spot on with the campaign the whole way. And they're like, we have this idea. We have like 2 days to film it. And like, we'll need your guys' help in VFX. So we were actually kind of involved in this Super Bowl spot, which was really fun. But they're like, we want to make it look like you came back from a commercial break at the Super Bowl. We're going to film it at the Superdome. And Stitch is going to break out on the field and start running around the field.
Oh, I remember that.
And that spot went insane. Like that was the movie spot of that Super Bowl, that it just felt like, oh, that cut through and the way you always want these things to, and you never know, like like how much can you get out of a 15-second just cut down traditional trailer, obviously you get eyeballs on it, but it's not necessarily the impact. This was like people love this. And, so when it came on a tracking, I think that was a big part of it, and it came on big. And then it's always that thing of like, you start getting into that big tracking zone that it sort of doesn't matter anymore. It's like,
right.
It's over 80, like it could be 80 or it could be 180 and it's going to look the same tracking, which was sort of the case. But yeah, you could just sort of feel the momentum, which is ironic because it was sort of the opposite for me on Aladdin. Aladdin's tracking was plummeting. And on that one, we just ended up we got a great cinema score. And we just sort of played and played and played all summer. But this was sort of a unique experience of like, you can feel that swell of momentum.
So what's next for Lilo and Stitch?
We are in heavy active development on the sequel. And, as you referenced, Chris Sanders, he's writing it right now, who's amazing. It's fun to be back there with the guy who literally, as you said, started as a kid's book, drew the character, has voiced the character in every single incarnation, and now is back working with us on this one. So it's been really fun to kind of go back to the source. But we're trying to target, maybe a production late this year, and then we've got a date. So it's Memorial Day 2028.
That's always good. Always good to have a date. You know when you're gonna, when it's over. You know when it'll be done.
Well, it's a funny thing because it's such a different experience. The first time around, you go from like, does anyone want to make this? How do you push this boulder up the hill? What's every step along the way to actually get it made? And then it's always in these cases, like it just flip-flops great, just get it going. And you're like, but there's no story. Like we've got to come up with an original story and we have to make it good, and it's sometimes that momentum is great because you have a lane to get this thing made. And then it's also the challenge because there is that sort of hurry up quality of trying to get something into production, but wanting to make sure it stands up to the first movie. So, it'll be a lot of work. It'll be a very different process, for sure. But, really excited for it.
Amazing. Well, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. It was really interesting for me to go through it, and I'm excited to do more of these. So as I like to do at the end of all these, and it's so appropriate on this one, best memory on set.
There was a day we shot in the water, and we had to do the rock running scene. If you remember, the sister Nani, played by Sydney, has to like actually physically rock run on the bottom, and so we had like a weight that was going to be. And it was sort of like, well, if you can't do it, we have a double that was going to do it anyway. And it's like, you're sitting on the boat. I'm like, this is great. I'm just in a boat in Hawaii. Like she's 30 feet under the water doing this in, sort of the west side of the island. And, and then you've obviously got to coordinate these underwater cameras and where they are. And like, there was just like one shot it's in the movie that it's just like the ferocity and the performance, and like she needed to run like 15 feet for the shot and she ran like 75 feet, like just kept going. And you really got goosebumps where you're like, this is incredible. And you're like, I'm in Hawaii. Like it's this amazing day. This was getting close to the end of production. And it just was like, it was like rays of sun beaming down. And then you had this like actress who just like did this incredible physical feat, and and again, I think that's one of those moments that I think people do get goosebumps in the film. So it's fun when like you actually feel those in real time, and then a year or so later you see it on screen and you're like, we felt it. So
this is what I tell everybody, every producer that doesn't want to go on set. I'm like, what? You're going to miss it. You're going to miss the rays of sun on the boat in Hawaii with the actress running 75 feet underwater. Well, Jonathan, thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's such an honor to be here. All the amazing people you've had on this podcast. It's a real honor to be included in that. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jonathan. You're the best. I appreciate you very much, and good luck with Lilo and Stitch too.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in for this episode of The Producer's Guide. If you're a fan of this podcast, make sure to rate, review, subscribe, and share with your friends and family. And if you got any questions about producing, send me a DM on X at Todd_Garner. I want to thank my producer, Steve Delamater. And until next week, I'm Todd Garner. See you then.